Shalom and welcome to the weekly Torah portion commentary of Jewels of Judaism. This week's Torah portion is called Noach, or in English, Noah, and it's found in Genesis chapters 6 to 11. Most of us are familiar with the story of Noah, how he built the ark, there was the flood, and then God made a covenant with Noah, and the sign of that covenant is the rainbow. So I want to focus this week's study on the covenant that God made with Noah. Now, as I began to study the covenant, I realized that this covenant is classified in a very particular way. It's called an everlasting covenant, or in Hebrew, Brit Olam. And we read about this in Genesis 9:16. It says, "When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." So now we understand that the covenant that God was making included his promise to never flood the earth again entirely, to destroy the earth, to destroy all flesh on the earth. And the sign would be the bow in the sky, the rainbow. Now, why does God call this an everlasting covenant? And what is the significance of the everlasting covenant? As I began to study this phrase, everlasting covenant, or in Hebrew, Brit Olam, in the Bible, it's used 16 times in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, of those 16 times, most of them are focused on the covenant that God made with Abraham and his descendants. However, there is one verse, and it's found in Isaiah chapter 24, which directly correlates with the everlasting covenant that we read about in Genesis 9. Now, Isaiah chapter 24 is very apocalyptic, dealing with end times, and it says this in Isaiah 24, verses 5 and 6. "The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few are left." So here we read clearly how it is describing the end times, and God is saying that those who are dwelling in the earth, the inhabitants of the earth, are guilty of breaking the everlasting covenant. Now, it's interesting that it's the same context of the destruction of the earth as we read about in this week's Torah portion. But why is God destroying the earth again, and how are the people guilty of breaking this everlasting covenant? Isn't the everlasting covenant simply God's promise to not flood the earth again and destroy it? Well, as we go back to Genesis chapter 9, we actually see in context that there is requirements that God gave to man. And it says this in Genesis 9, verse 5. "And surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. And from every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man." So in the context of this everlasting covenant that God made with Noah and with his sons and all flesh at that time, he was making a very clear requirement that everyone respect the life of another, and that no one take the innocent life of another. And whoever does this, his own life will be required from him. And I believe that this is the context of Isaiah 24, where it talks about the inhabitants of the earth have broken the everlasting covenant. And it includes this sanctity of life and protecting life and not taking innocent life. And so there is going to be a day of judgment in the end of time where God will bring to account all the innocent life that is taken, and inhabitants of the earth are going to be judged at that time. And it says judged with fire in comparison with judged with water. So one thing we see is that the Noahic covenant, the covenant that God made with Noah, is an everlasting covenant. And there is a reminder that there's also a day of judgment to come in the future that will not be pretty. There's a day of judgment. On the positive side, there's another connection here that I want to make, and that is this phrase everlasting covenant In every other place it's used outside of these two places that I read in Genesis 9 and Isaiah 24, in every other instance of the 14 places it's used, 16 total, but 14 others, it's used in connection with the promise, the covenant that God made with Abraham and his descendants. And it's connected to the Messiah. So the next place that the phrase Brit Olam, everlasting covenant, is used in the Bible is in Genesis 17. And this is where God is reminding Abraham of the covenant that he's making with him. And God is reminding Abraham that he will make him a father of many nations, that he will give to his descendants the land of Canaan as an inheritance. And he's also reminding Abraham that a son will come through his wife Sarah by his own loins, through his own loins. But Abraham was struggling to believe this. And it says this in Genesis 17:18. And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." But God said, "No, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." Literally, for his seed after him. God was telling Abraham that he's going to fulfill his covenant with Abraham. And part of that fulfillment is the everlasting covenant that comes through his seed. Now this, in the short term, this was fulfilled through Isaac. This is also fulfilled through the nation of Israel, which comes through Abraham's seed. Then it's through the line of David, and eventually through the Messiah who comes into the earth. And so this everlasting covenant that God was establishing through the seed of Abraham would ultimately be fulfilled in the Messiah, who gives his own life, his innocent blood, for the sake of the guilty. And so we kind of almost have like a reversing. In the Noahic covenant, you have the person who takes another life is required to give his own life. And there's going to be a judgment that comes in the end days as a result of the Noahic covenant. And God is saying, as a result of the Abrahamic covenant, there is going to be life for those who believe in the substitutionary death of the Messiah. So this is what we learn in connection to the Noahic covenant. There's an everlasting covenant that God has. There is judgment that's coming on this earth, but there's also life for those who believe in the Messiah, which is through the Abrahamic covenant. I've given you a very brief overview of my commentary of this week's Torah portion. I want to invite you to read my full commentary on my website, jewelsofjudaism.com, under the title, The Everlasting Covenant. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like it on YouTube. Feel free to share it with others. And as always, Shabbat Shalom.